Where do you all want to start?
Well, I have a couple of questions.
Please.
This chapter seems to indicate that it's about sharing the mind of Christ. But when you read it, I don't get that.
Yeah.
Other than a couple of things. Possibly. And one is when I originally, when I was young and read the Bible, Paul's writings, and he was talking about being worldly, I thought, well, it means you're a person of the world, you're sophisticated, but that's not what this definition means. It means you're, I think, more concerned with the secular rather than the sacred, which is carries negative connotation, rather than, I could say, somebody who's sophisticated and understands the world is not parochial, which carries negative connotations. So that's a little confusing, but then is he using this concept of worldly to mean you don't have the mind of Christ? Or where does he get the mind of Christ from his reading?
Yeah, thanks. And this,
And if you have any thoughts about the use of the word worldly, I know it's an English term. He probably used some Greek term, but why did they choose that word?
yeah, it actually comes into question one about there's these two words that show up in Greek, sarx and soma. So they actually both mean body. Like, but apparently your soma is like your good body, and your sarx is like your worldly body, pejorative.
Mhm.
Now, he mentioned in the video that Paul is not one of these dualists where like body bad, spirit good. So I think what he's trying to do is basically say there's like I don't want to say there's two ways of living as if there's an either or, because obviously there's a lot of shades in between two ways of being, right? But I think he's trying to contrast the mind of Christ and the not mind of Christ.
Okay.
So what he does is he employs two words for body. They mean the same thing, but one is sort of like the fulfilled body for him, and then the sarx is sort of the worldly body. Now, Paul doesn't think the world's bad and fallen and evil. That's not like in the Jewish mind. That's a Platonic idea, right? So what does he mean? Maybe he means something like, this is going to sound really philosophical, but I don't know if that's sort of wrong. I mean, we sort of are taught how to interact with the world by culture, by and large, right? Like that's how we grew up. And hey, if we grew up in Saudi Arabia, we'd have a really different cultural worldview than we have here, right? So if we mistake the cultural worldview for like the good thing, that's the mistake. So the mind of Christ transcends culture, and maybe the worldly view is that we only know Christ in our own culture.
Yeah.
I know that sounds like a fine line, but it is a fine line. The whole chapter is like a fine line, right? So like our instincts aren't bad, but maybe the worldly person is somebody who follows instincts without considering others.
More self-centered. No, you don't.
Yeah. I mean, maybe so, but I would even say like I actually think like culture and society is really important. Like I think that's integral, because like the instincts we have are not just biological instincts. We've been trained to have civil instincts.
Mhm.
We got biological instincts,
Right.
but consider that most adults don't actually know when they're hungry. We eat when it's dinner time, and we eat when it's lunchtime, and we eat when it's breakfast time. Yeah, I don't even know if I'm hungry. It's time to eat. Is that okay that I said that?
Yeah.
That's kind of how we've ordered meals, right? So on the one hand, the instinct to eat when I'm hungry is like pure and natural, but I don't even know that instinct very well. I know it's 6 o'clock. So I think that's the worldliness Paul is talking about. Not, I eat when I'm hungry, I eat when it's dinner time. That's like some kind of worldly way of behaving. It's got its pros, but it's not even honoring to our natural instincts all the time. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It
Yeah.
does. I was kind of thinking that it was acting, with the crowd kind of thing. And instead of checking in for that still small voice to see, is this the right thing to do? Maybe.
I mean, I think that can be a real parallel thought, right? And sometimes the crowd's got really good ideas. Sometimes the crowd's got really good ideas. So it's not like secular wisdom is always wrong. It's that sometimes we mistake secular instinct for like instinct of God.
Did what?
Secular instinct for instinct of God.
Oh.
They're not always the same. Can I be really controversial just for a second?
Go for it.
So, look, I think we're all aware that there's like a horrendous thing going on in Israel right now. And there's this instinct. Again, I'm not trying to be pejorative, but there's an instinct for people to say, let's pray for peace in Jerusalem, or let's pray that those bad guys get their consequences. Which in some ways, like I get it, it's a knee-jerk reaction to this bad thing happened, and we want to set it right. We don't know how to do that, so we'll just punish the perpetrators. Without acknowledging that there's a history of like awful behavior on both sides. Well, why would these people do it? Well, do you know how they've been treated? Well, that doesn't give them an excuse. Okay. I hope you hear what I'm saying, right? Sometimes we have a very worldly response to something that seems very acute and wrong to us because we haven't actually considered the whole situation and frankly our own role in a very unjust structure that continues to be awful. No, I don't mean it's all willy-nilly and hey, like, good for them for taking care of like injustice as they perceive it. What I mean is it's often very, very complicated, and we don't like to hold on to complicated things. We like to neaten it up. Hamas bad, Israel good, bad guy gets punished, and then we can go to bed, right? But it isn't that neat.
So we do that daily.
Oh, we absolutely do it daily.
And I think that's, my opinion is that's kind of where all this comes from. Is we're educated in one way. It doesn't mean, I might be educated financially and somebody else socially, and we're trying to do something for the church, but I'm coming with my views. It doesn't mean I'm trying to be selfish, but I've got a view in this, and then somebody from a social standpoint goes, that's really not very nice for the people, So, I think that's just, we get in a horrible mess because we're not really taught to consider somebody else's view as you're going through school or whatever. You're taught one way, and to be mature and say, oh, well, maybe that one's not right, but you went through 8 years and you were taught to do this and you were taught to do that, and then you got out the business world and you did it, and oh dear, oh, I should really consider what you have to say.
And I don't know the right answer to this, but when we start talking about the mind of Christ, what is that? I don't know if it is precept based or if it is consideration based, right? So the mind of Christ may not be, you can only think these thoughts. And if you don't think one of these thoughts, you did it wrong. So I guess that's one view. But another view is, boy, I wonder what else is going on in that person where they would do this particular thing. So some expansive room making seems to be at least one characteristic of the mind of Christ. Easier example, let's take politics off the table. Somebody cuts you off in traffic and they're speeding and they're driving crazy, right? Could be really easy to say it's because they're a jerk. They're just trying to ruin my day. They have a death wish. They don't care about anything on the road. Or you could say, wow, they're driving in a way that seems really unsafe. I wonder if they're rushing to the hospital. I wonder if something else, right? You don't know which one's true. You probably never will. Like, you can't know unless you interviewed them, right? And even then, you might say, you still shouldn't drive that fast. You're putting yourself at risk, right? But it seems like a characteristic of the mind of Christ might be, I wonder why they're doing that, instead of they're doing that so they're wrong and they should be punished. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think you're right, and I think you can think about it individually, like the person cutting you off. You're an individual, they're an individual. It gets really complicated when it's countries, because people, I kind of think of this as a worldly thing. Part of our instinct is to develop an us versus them mentality. That's just human. And if you don't believe it, go look at chimpanzees. I mean, they're our closest relative, and they're invading each other's tribes and slaughtering others and for their territory all the time. They're very warlike. And, you know, we have that in our DNA to have like a us versus them. And if we want to rise above that and give people the benefit of the doubt, like you're talking about, I think that's kind of where the Christ mind is, to rise above that us versus them. Or like when you're on the highway and think, oh, that guy's a jerk, but it turned out, you know, his wife's in intensive care. You don't know. And so to give people the benefit of the doubt might be a Christ thing, to just think a moment before you make a snap judgment.
Don't you think if you look at the life of Christ, okay, so the woman at the well, he knows she's done all these bad things, but he says, just turn around and do this. But it also runs out all the people in the temple who are selling things. And so I don't think the mind of Christ is just the good side of everyone. I think the mind of Christ is more about something bigger than that. The whole, like, there are things that aren't right.
Oh, but I don't mean,
Right, or sharing ideas and coming to
Yeah.
a community.
I'm not suggesting the mind of Christ means I'm okay, you're okay, we're all okay. I would say actually that, you know, when we give people empathy and consideration, that's actually the only way we can give someone a fair trial. Because if somebody's evil, they don't even get a trial. They're not human. I mean, this is actually one of our constitutional principles. If I catch you red-handed, you still get a jury trial. Because that's your fundamental sort of right as a citizen in this country. You're supposed to get a jury trial, even if I caught you red-handed. Think how silly that is.
Yeah.
If I caught you red-handed, why do you get a trial? Because you're a human being. That's what we decided, right?
Well, because sometimes there's mitigating factors about why you did it.
Because there's
It's really, it's weird to think about. I mean, whenever I was going through, I was just thinking a lot about, because I guess especially if you're raised in the church, you hear a lot about the mind of Christ and, you know, being worldly and likely, or put it, I think it's secular versus sacred. But a lot of the time when I feel like we want to be compassionate and we want to be Christ-like, you know, we're saying something like, that person in traffic cut me off. What if they had an emergency that, you know, I would be really understanding about? But that's, which is a good thing to do. And it's still saying, I hope they have a circumstance that I think is okay for them to have been acting that way. It's not, you know, I mean, it is some compassion, but it's not a fullness of saying, regardless of why that person was speeding, maybe they're just having a terrible day and they really just want to get home. Maybe they're just a huge jerk and they're super selfish and they speed every time because they're reckless with themselves, because they're depressed and life sucks, or they're just somebody who was raised in extreme wealth and they've never had to want for anything. I mean, it's like, regardless of what the reason is why they're doing what they're doing, my mind and my principles and my character say that I will not speed up to go flip them off. Instead, regardless of why they did that,
Yeah.
I'm gonna like take a deep breath and continue to keep everybody around me safe in traffic, and I'm gonna choose whatever I think, you know, in accordance with whatever is
Yeah.
really the right thing to do, and whether that's like the most compassionate thing to do or the thing that keeps everyone safe, or, you know, so sometimes I think, you know, and this is just like you know, me on my own journey, so whatever, but, sometimes I think whenever I wanna be, you know, walk with the light of Christ, I'm more so thinking about what do I have within my power to control that will edify and uplift me and the person across from me. And sometimes, you know, that might mean saying, hey, what you're doing is wrong, you're hurting everybody. And, you know, sometimes it's minding your own business. So you know,
Well, and I think you said a really interesting thing that I appreciate. So like, even though I can say, to going back to the traffic thing, right? Like, well, you had a valid reason in my opinion, because like, that's whatever, somebody would do that. There is also this interesting thought where I sometimes have, where I think, I hope you get caught.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
hope there's a
I'm not-
policeman over there.
I'm not convinced
There
that
never
actually
is, but,
belongs in the
you know.
mind of Christ,
Yeah.
that I hope you get punished.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know that I think that that belongs in the mind of Christ. Accountability, yes. Punishment, I don't know. And this is where it gets really sticky.
Yeah,
It is, because you could say, I hope you get caught, like you're watching your child's feet everywhere, and you think, God, I hope they have to pay $1,000 fine and work a long time to pay it off, and they're super annoyed about it, so that they'll stop doing it and
Yeah.
endangering themselves, and that is
Right.
compassionate. But also just, yeah, hoping somebody gets punished. Yeah,
Because there's a
right.
difference between accountability and punishment,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Accountability, like definitely want that from my kids. Sometimes I even want my kids to be punished. I do. I want vengeance on them because they've so flouted their moral upbringing. No, they've so flouted like the moral principles that I tried to ground them in. I don't even just want them to get even. I want them to suffer.
Well, if-
I might be alone.
Oh, no, a couple of weeks ago, I don't know how I got onto it, but I was following Koinonia Fellowship. Looking into fellowship.
Yeah.
And one of the things it talked about was why we have fellowship, and we are obligated as Christians to have fellowship because we are basically growing in the body and mind of Christ. And one of the things that we should be doing is admonishing one another. You know, if I see you mess up, I could say, you're messing up, so that you can improve and thus improve all of us. So I don't think it's bad. And sometimes the only way people are gonna learn is if they're punished.
Yeah, and I would say, or held accountable.
No,
right?
well,
And-
held accountable, yeah.
And I would say as a teacher, they always say this and it becomes silly, but there is a certain point, right, where nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so that is part of it, right? Like I know people who love to be accountability people and I don't detect like an ounce of compassion in them.
yeah.
Yeah.
So therefore, like, I don't want to hear that.
Yeah, there are people like that.
So this is interesting. And the other thing that's interesting is sacred secular. That's not a distinction that's made in this book.
Mhm.
There's really no such thing. Like all things are meant to be holy. Now, sure, some things are more set apart for traditional uses, but there's not places where God's absent. And this is part of the mind of Christ, if I can say again too. Don't you know, here's how the NIV reads. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple and God's spirit lives in you? I don't know if your translation reads that way. It's an accurate translation, except that the word you in English can refer to both second person singular and second person plural.
Mhm.
So a more wooden translation from Greek to English would say, don't y'all know that y'all are God's temple and God's spirit lives in y'all,
Mhm.
not in you, in y'all. That's a different understanding because that means when there's somebody who I don't like, whether they're speeding or they're a member of Hamas, God's spirit lives in y'all. So the question is, how do we contain and adorn and invite? Sometimes not well, sometimes not well, but we don't, it seems like we don't get to say, but not you. God's spirit lives in us, but not you. This seems like this is addressing in all y'all.
Mhm.
I've shared this before in a sermon. When we lived in Germany, we lived in Dresden for a second. And Dresden was the Florence of the Elbe. Like, it had no military targets and it was absolutely beautiful. And the Allies firebombed it. You can read about this in Slaughterhouse-Five. Kurt Vonnegut was there. They punitively destroyed the whole city as revenge for Germans bombing Coventry. Like, this is all documented, right? So razed it to the ground, no military targets. And there's a particular church there that it's called like the Church of Mary. In German, it's the Frauenkirche. It's Lutheran, unadorned. And the only thing left of the whole church was one window. And it was made out of limestone. Of course, it was black because they'd firebombed it, right? So the whole dome collapsed, all the other windows, and there's just this kind of standing archway, no glass in it. And you can see that photo. And as funds became available, the city and patrons rebuilt the church. And they left that window, the black one, and then they used complicated computer modeling to find every stone that was original and figuring out where to put it. So the new church is made of white limestone, and all the burned down blocks are black. And so there's a black window, a white dome with a couple of peppered black blocks in it, and then black blocks here and there, right? It would have been a lot cheaper to bulldoze it. It would have been a lot more efficient. But in some ways, that's kind of like maybe another aspect of the mind of Christ. These things that are useless and inefficient, we'll spend extra time to figure out where they can fit. They can fit somewhere, even if it's just under the pavement. They fit somewhere.
What they're doing it also is kind of a memorial,
I think so.
maybe, so that we don't forget.
Yeah, Germany is really interesting with how they do stuff like that. All the stained glass in general that got blown out, they've replaced with like ultra modern.
Yeah.
You know, so it used to be very apostles feeding, this kind of thing, and now it's like crazy, like abstract lines and you know, in these huge Gothic things that got these wild looking windows. Is like, we're not going backward, we're going forward. It's interesting to think through. I don't know if I answered. I don't know if we got to your question.
Are we kind of challenged when we look at situations to think, well, what would Christ do in this situation?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Is it okay if I introduce this term? I just got reminded of this by Richard Rohr in the past week. You know, there's Jesus and there's Christ. And I know Christ is the title. But Richard Rohr, I don't know if you know this guy. He's a kind of a Catholic monk, big time thinker, right? He says that actually Christ is cosmic. And so Christ is actually greater than the person Jesus. Jesus is how we know the Christ.
Yeah.
But the Christ isn't just limited to the one person Jesus. The reason I'm saying this, right, is that Jesus himself grew up in a culture that's not ours. In some ways, we've improved on that culture. In other ways, maybe we haven't, right? And I think that the Christ, if you don't mind me saying, is probably not bound by any culture, but hopefully transforms every culture. But I don't think the mind of Christ means live like a first century Galilean peasant, because that's how Jesus lived.
Right.
I think the mind of Christ means, how do we transform our culture, our individuality, our structures, our community to be in line not with the human, like embodied Jesus, but the cosmic Christ. Is that okay? Does that sound weird what I'm saying?
Yeah, I've always thought that. Same thing.
This is Richard Rohr's language,
Yeah.
not mine.
I think I've read some stuff from him.
I'm not taking away from the incarnation, not. We just realized it was at a particular time in a particular context, right? That's very different from our own, like really different from our own. So we don't have to adopt the culture of the human Jesus in order to know Christ. Like, we don't have to do that, because the risen Christ is transcendent of that culture and our own. I hope that cleaned that up a little bit.
Yeah.
That's where I think if we read this as, me personally, if we read the mind of Christ as a set of precepts, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that, we might have misread it.
So when I use the phrase, what would Jesus do? I'm not really thinking of the cosmic Christ.
Well, I think actually that phrase would in some ways we equate the two, which is not to our peril, but I think that movement, what would Jesus do, probably really means, what would the cosmic Christ do? I think that's really what that phrase means. I'm not saying we need to tinker with it. I just wanted to, for the sake of this, draw that distinction potentially. Yeah, so what would the cosmic Christ do?
I think that's a good way of thinking about it. In these situations, you know.
I know what the American Jesus would do. I hope you don't mind me saying, I mean, I know that. And I'm not putting the country down, like I'm proud to be American. But we do this thing in this country where we conflate Jesus with America sometimes. I mean, we do. To our peril, if I'm honest,
Oh, yeah.
to our peril, we do it, right? So I know what American Jesus would do. I'm not always clear what the cosmic Christ would do. And that seems like part of the point of discipleship. Now, I'm going to be an American citizen. Like, I'm going to do that. I'm not going to revoke my citizenship. And honestly, there's sometimes, I think there's times where situations benefit the nation that may not be part of the mind of Christ. And I might even vote that way. Because I don't always have an alternative. And I have to admit, benefiting America is part of my self-interest because I live here. I don't live in Swaziland. So I think we always have a foot firmly here. And the question is, do we have 2 feet here or just one?
Do you think it's harder for us today because our world is so complicated, and back 2,000 years ago, was life really simpler or no?
I mean, I don't know. I think, like, I'm not an anthropologist, right? What I think is that we struggle with, like right now, more and more, we struggle with things like patience. We don't have it because you can have whatever you want right now. All of us in the
Yeah.
room in general didn't have what we wanted immediately when we were kids. Like we were bored some, and we had to do things like to build skills, right? So like I had to memorize multiplication tables. Kids don't even have to do that anymore, depending what state they live in, because they just do it on a calculator. I don't mean that's good or bad. I just mean we had to do things for discipline's sake.
Right.
And I'm not a great artist. I'm not a great artist, but I had to take art lessons. You know what I mean? Now, if you're not a good artist, well, just don't do it. You can do it on the computer and it's fine. So I don't mean it's good or bad. It's just different. And I don't know that it was simpler. I mean, a lot of people had no idea if they were going to eat that night.
That's true. And it was a lot shorter then. I mean, people were dead.
Average
by the time they
lifespan
were
was 35,
Mhm.
right? 1 in 4 kids died by the time they were 12.
Yeah, they did. And women were dead by menopause. Dead.
Really, really dangerous having a kid. Still is. Actually, this is the most dangerous country to have a child in. Of all developed countries, this is the most dangerous one.
And let's talk about how crappy Texas is.
Mhm.
So I
Number
think,
one.
I don't know that we can say better, worse, easier, harder. I think we just have to say different.
Mhm.
And different, my child is growing up in a culture really different from the ones you all grew up in, and substantially different from my own, right? But add 15 years to me, and we got a totally different situation for my 11-year-old. You know, I mean, that's just the pace of technology, really different.
Well, we're not really teaching communication, relationships, how to negotiate. At a young age. I mean, when you get older, there's more of that, but part of it is our cell phone or whatever, because we don't have to. We can text and we can do that. You go to school, you don't have to have the multiplication tables, you don't have to go shoot, you just do algebra on the computer now, most of it, I think.
You may not even do it. I mean, right,
Yeah,
because the
right.
computer can do it for you. So
For
you
you.
need to be computer literate, not math literate.
That's right, and so I think it really, patience is not, I mean, I'm speaking for my grandchildren. patience is not really high on their list because they really haven't been taught that they have to be patient.
And they may not actually have to be.
And they may,
And that's where we're living in two different things. And I don't think this is totally tangential. I think this is really helpful to think through that, like, our grandkids and even some of our younger kids are experiencing a different culture than we did. And I know we're all living together at the same time, but I guarantee you my mind's doing something different with the same stimulus as my kids is,
oh, yeah. And
because I
sometimes
was
it's hard
formed in a
to-
different way, right?
That's true.
Gosh, my work is basically early sixties and thirties. And there is the communication skills and there's a vast difference.
This is where I want to go back to, like, the mind of Christ has to be the cosmic transcendent Christ, not the Christ of culture itself,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, this question, at the end of number 1, it says, in what ways have you witnessed self-centeredness masquerading as love and faithfulness? It's really interesting because I think about, just our children. I mean, we all suck at it, but especially our children learning how to, like, what does it mean to have the mind of Christ online? And especially whenever you don't, you might, I mean,
Do they
nothing's
Google
a secret. You can always track some stuff down, so don't ever do anything online that you wouldn't be proud for everyone to know about. But this like land of anonymity where you're online and you can kind of just create a username and say whatever you want. And what that really looks like and what that really means. And there are obvious circumstances for them of, just like bullying people online. But I sometimes think about, just in a world in which we are more connected than ever before and weirdly so disconnected. Because of the exact same tool that, what can seem loving and faithful, as in I'm just faithfully following your social media presence, or I'm faithfully commenting on things that you post, but I never pick up the phone. I never text you. I don't come by your house and check on you. I don't, and then other times it's like someone's in a horrible place and just posting something online and having people respond to it and realizing that they're not totally alone saves their life. It's just such a weird thing. I mean, I guess it depends on, like, dependency and obsession and lots of other things, addiction, but yeah.
We're taking it to a new level with this chat. Whatever.
GPT.
We're taking it to, I mean, they're writing, they're doing obituaries, they're doing, so it's not really the person or the family writing about with the sincerity or, what was special and what was godly and what was about that person. And we don't have time, we just put it in there and I'm like, what?
Please.
I owned a childcare center for 20 years and it was in this area. And I have been getting reconnected with a lot of the parents of the children that I raised. Recently, I had lunch, 3.5 hours lunch with one of my former moms at a restaurant where her son was one of the wait staff. So we surprised him. And, he would pop over and talk and, show me pictures of his children. And, it was just the most incredible experience. But I said to him as I was leaving, Rob, are you on Facebook? Can I friend you? And he said, oh, no, I'm not on that. He said, I'm so tired of reading about people's perfect lives. And I don't have a perfect life, so I'm not on Facebook. And I said, well, you know what, Rob, most of that stuff is a lie anyway.
Yeah.
And he said, I know, that's what my mom said.
Is Rob under 40?
He is 29.
Yeah, that's another reason he's not on Facebook. People under 40 aren't on Facebook.
Yeah, he's 29.
Really?
Yeah, Facebook's for
yeah.
older people. Like, it
Yeah.
really is. People who are under 40 are on, like, Snapchat and Instagram.
Instagram, yeah.
But really, Facebook's for people 40 and above.
Yeah.
Just,
People my son's age
You
are barely on Instagram and they're mostly on just TikTok.
TikTok is TikTok's the new Snapchat,
It
right?
is, yeah.
That'll be another new thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you don't mind me saying, I think there's a lot of examples, but I'm gonna talk to examples I've seen in church, right? So forgive me for doing this, because I do this, but like, sometimes we get up there, well-intentioned clergy, and we give a sermon and we're the hero of our own story. And I'm gonna tell you, that's called self-centeredness masquerading as love and faithfulness when it happens too often.
Mhm.
It's okay to do it sometimes, right? But when we're the faithful example par excellence, all that is not even egotism, right? That's id. That's an id problem where, look, I'm telling y'all, I know how to do this well. To be honest, and I do this as a parent sometimes, I try not to, but sometimes I mistake righteousness with social control.
Yeah,
So, it's a thing to tell your daughter, like, don't wear that short skirt. It's real iffy clothes with girls, right? We don't have conversations with boys about clothes because in general, we know that women are more vulnerable, right? But very rarely do we approach it, hey, it's not your problem how you dress. Other people have problems, so you need to be shrewd. We don't usually approach that because we think our girls can't handle it. But that's the truth.
mhm.
Boys wear what they want. So girls should wear what they want, and boys should have self-control and respect women's rights. And the fact that they don't is a problem. Now, maybe that's a big lecture and my 10-year-old didn't want to hear it. I don't know, but sometimes I'll tell you, we do self-centeredness masquerading as love. We do. As parents, we do this in church sometimes, right? And I know I don't do it in order to do this, right? Like I try to live my own life, but I'll tell you, when I'm wearing a collar, sometimes I get looks, and usually it goes like this.
What are they trying to reconcile?
And no, they're not even trying to, I don't know what they're doing. It happened most recently to me at Camp Allen, when a clergy spouse came and did that to me and said, oh, you must be one of the new curates.
Form of life.
Or that. No, I get that.
Yeah.
You must have lived a rough life. No, I actually didn't. Like, it was pretty good. Like, it was just pretty comfortable. And look, I know that's silly, but I can tell you it's real. Like, it happens almost every day to me.
Yeah.
And maybe I knew better. I knew people would do that, but I shouldn't have to manage other people's thoughts about me, about my own. It's my body. It's not yours.
Right.
So I shouldn't have to do that. So if we want to talk about masquerading as love and faithfulness, part of it is, I don't want that for me. And what you do is none of my business. And I still don't want that for me, and that's fine. You know, I mean, this becomes a more faithful response. And while I can talk about this in a judgy way, there's other things people do, like, that I'm super judgy about. Yeah.
And you catch yourself.
Not always. I don't always. If I'm honest though, then I,
Some young girl not dressed by what I think is right because I'm worried about her. And I will make what in her mother, I'll make some stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw a man today who was like wearing a stained white shirt. And I didn't know if he was working in a place. I was like, my God, like, pull yourself together. Like, just pull yourself together. Wear a black shirt if you're gonna have stains on. Like, I have these kinds of thoughts because,
Well, we all do. We're human.
We're human.
It's okay. We're human.
well, in a sense,
Work
it's
on it.
okay to have the mind of an American, but like, I'd like to have the mind of Christ. I think that's what Paul's calling us out. Not calling us out. I think he's actually encouraging, right? This be encouraging.
Yeah, I think probably other than in myself, probably the biggest place that I find it just disturbing to see things that, kind of masquerade as love and faithfulness is whenever you're listening to messages or especially, from the pulpit, because there's just so much like influence and power there. But You know, I was listening to a sermon once and they were talking about a particular sin that they just found particularly egregious, that I don't even think is a sin. And it's just human nature. And I remember how, just disgusted they were, and it really just broke me inside, because, you know, I was thinking about the passionate way this person was saying this, and I wanted to get up and leave. And then I kind of just glanced around me and I saw all these people nodding, and I thought, this is how hate crimes happen. You know, like you have so much power, and you're talking, you're not just saying, I think this is wrong, I think this is a sin, which that's your right, that's fine, I guess. But I mean, no, it's fine. They have their opinions and that's fine. But, you know, to then sit and convey so much disgust and hatred for it by just labeling it sin and saying, I hate this, therefore God hates this, therefore, you know, and really riling people up and influencing them so much. Like that energy goes somewhere, and often it leads to action.
Yeah.
And I don't think that person would ever say it was wrong to physically harm another human being. That very same person, I do not think he would ever say that it was wrong to harm another person physically. But a lot of people are lost and hurting and scared and sad, and they're just driven by fear. So
Yeah.
it just was such an irresponsible, this is my judgment. It was just such an irresponsible use of the power of that position. And it was masquerading as, get your tables out of this temple.
Mhm.
And it really just.
Yeah, and if I think we could all come up with a bunch. I'm just gonna give you one more, right? Because we're making this memorial honoring Black contributions to the space program, right? And I've had people say, well, that's divisive. That's a divisive thing to do. Why aren't you celebrating all astronauts? Why are we drawing attention to needs of some ethnic racial groups? We should be celebrating all ethnic racial groups. It's masquerading as love. It's not even intentional, right? But what it's saying, right, is don't give special emphasis to somebody as a way of remediating that they've never had any recognition before. Don't do that, because that's divisive. It's a conversation I'm very willing and happy to have, but it's very rarely it's really a conversation desire. It's usually I don't like that, right? I don't like it because it draws attention to something ugly I'd rather not remember or think about. And I can understand we don't want to think about the past, but really the goal is how do we tell stories that weren't told? I mean, really, that's it. How do we tell
They don't
stories?
want to have a discussion, they just want.
Well, I don't want to have a discussion most of the time, if I'm honest. If I'm honest, I don't want to. Like my brother, I already know what he thinks. He probably thinks he already knows what I think. So what's the point in talking? So we don't. That's how we resolve that. I think you know what I'm talking about. You got family members who you already know each other, so why have it out again, right? I am not converting to his point of view. And he is not interested in mine. So we don't have much to talk about at the end of the day. I don't know what the mind of Christ looks like there. I'm still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, and what about the religious white people that tore all the Native Americans' children away from their parents and forced them not to use their language anymore and told them your culture's horrible and you're gonna serve Jesus? That's exactly what that is.
Yeah, actually, and the
So
slogan was
separateness.
save the man, kill the Indian.
Yeah, because they did all of that but this is what God wants us to do. And then you wonder why do those same people, would they not want to follow a God that told you
Yeah,
to do those horrible
exactly,
things?
and I don't
to
think
people.
Jesus would agree with taking the people out of their culture and out of their religion even.
And here's the
forcing
amazing
them.
statement. Even if the human Jesus would, the cosmic Christ wouldn't.
I know he wouldn't.
I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
Sometimes we say Jesus was parochial, well, because he was, just like we're parochial, but the resurrected Christ isn't. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be abrasive with it, right? But we don't know that. I mean, Jesus even said to folks, I came first for the Jewish people, right? He said that.
Yeah, he did.
So that's the embodied Jesus. But course, we all understand, because we're not Jewish people, the cosmic Christ cares for us too, right? 'Cause I
Well,
hope,
he
I hope that
changed
makes
his
sense.
mind too, didn't he, when that lady
That lady
said-
taught him a lesson.
He said, we don't give food to dogs. I'm here for the Jewish people.
Yeah.
I'm not here for Gentiles. And she said, well, even the dogs eat the crumbs, and that changed his mind.
If you read the rest of the Gospel of Matthew after that, Jesus looks out for people who aren't Jewish all of a sudden. It's actually pretty interesting.
Yeah. So
Like he
it's-
feeds 5,000 Jewish people, and then there's 4,000 non-Jewish people, and he feeds all them.
Yeah.
After he meets that Syro-Phoenician woman,
Mhm.
because that's what the cosmic Christ would do.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to say that Jesus was a bad guy. I'm not saying that, right? What I'm trying to emphasize, right, is that there's the historical Jesus, and that's not the essence of our faith.
Mhm.
Our faith is predicated on the resurrected Jesus,
Yeah.
not just the historical one. Does that
Yeah,
make sense what I'm
makes
saying?
Yeah.
Perfect sense.
I have a question, this question, because I don't know. How do we then take that and I'm not even gonna say it right. How do we take that and justify is not the right word, interpret or come to some kind of balance on what we think is the Christ mind when we think about the immigration and at the border and all of that. I mean, that's really, you know, how do you do that from, you've got the political
Yeah.
end and I don't know.
Yeah.
Probably we do it slowly. I'm in a rush, so I hate to say that, but probably we do it slowly. We probably try to include a lot of opinions that are not ours and actually listen to them. I don't like doing that. I like straw man opinions so I can tear them down, but like actually listening to something that's not what we think and saying, well, what if there was truth in that? That would be helpful, at least. I mean, I don't know, because I don't. It sounds funny, like the mind of Christ feels elusive sometimes.
Right.
And the question he asked is, to what extent can our thoughts be under the Lord's dominion? And that's an interesting question. I grew up as a kid that there's thoughts you shouldn't have, like period dot. So if you've had a particular thought that wasn't on the list, that was wrong and evil, etc., and that reveals you've got bad character because you had that thought. I don't know, the word dominion, we usually understand the word dominion. That's the word he used in the film, right? What extent can our thoughts be under the Lord's dominion? We usually think dominion is rule and power, but it's the root is the word domicile. So what extent can our thoughts be in the Lord's household? Not under lockstep rule, but in God's house. What does it mean to think in God's house? I don't know. I'll tell you, there's a, I'm gonna butcher it. I wish I had the full quote. I ran into this rabbinic quote that comes out of the Kabbalistic tradition in Judaism last year that says, on Judgment Day, every person has to give an account for every desire that they had that they did not try to fulfill.
Oh, Lord.
Now, isn't that interesting? Because desires are given by God. Now, what we don't always do well is we try to meet desires in ways that aren't healthy. But the desire is given to us by God. Intimacy is a gift from God, right? Intimacy is a gift. It's a human need. God gave us that. There are ways we can meet that need through mutuality, and there's ways we can try to meet that need ineffectually, which, by the way, will never actually meet that need. It won't meet the need, and it will hurt us, and will usually hurt someone else worse. So, is it wrong that you want to have intimacy physically with another human being? No, that's a gift from God, like a gift that we have that desire and that need. But doing that with somebody who doesn't have ability to give consent is not good. But if we say, I have this desire, I shouldn't meet it, we have to give an accounting to God for that. Now that's interesting to think through, because that actually turns on its head kind of the way I grew up, desires for intimacy are wrong outside of marriage. Instead, desire for intimacy is really good.
It's like marriage is is the act of reconciliation.
It
It's
can
like,
be.
Intimacy is just wrong, period. But if you're married, God will reconcile.
That is actually how we've done it since the Middle Ages. That's how we've done it since the Middle Ages. But I find this like, frankly, rabbinic way of thinking very interesting, right? So, like, is God upset that you have a particular thought? Probably not. I think the question is, the mind of Christ asks us to consider what's the actual desire under that strategy. So look, I'm getting ready to go eat some ice cream, and like, why am I doing that? Am I doing that because I actually want the ice cream, or am I doing it because I'm stressed as hell? And if I can just have this sugar, then I won't deal with the stress. Because ice cream is not an effective strategy long-term for handling stress. Like, we get that,
Yeah.
right? Buying things on Amazon is a great way to meet my household needs. However, I can tell you, I go into people's houses and there's people who are way past their needs on that.
That's true.
The desire isn't wrong. The desire comes from a place of being equipped, right? In having what I need. And maybe it even has to do with like taking care of the needs of my household, or like, hey, I want to feel special with some clothes. Like, those aren't bad desires, but the strategy can go awry. So,
Well, I've had desires for revenge. And, you know, when someone hurt me physically or beat me up, I've had some things happen when I was younger. And I wanted to kill that person. That was a desire, but I just.
there's probably
decided-
something under that desire. Keep wanting to kill that person is
Protection.
probably a strategy.
Yeah.
And the desire is probably equality.
Oh, maybe so, yeah.
And wouldn't it be a gift of God to have a desire for equality? I think that's a gift. The problem is how I choose to meet that desire.
Well,
So
I didn't
come,
do anything.
yeah, well, because you're not wearing handcuffs, so that's probably why. But I think, Sherry, you asked a really, really good question, because particularly, let's go back to Hamas. What are we even gonna do about it in this room? What power do we have?
Prayer is all, prayer.
And we could probably write our congresspeople and we could say, hey, Representative Brian Babin, you advertise you're a person of faith, and yet I also hear you advocating for militaristic armed conflict. Please tell me how you get there from your faith stance.
Yeah,
And I think I could write that actually from a point of curiosity,
yeah,
Right.
not from accusation.
exactly.
I don't know if that would change anything. I don't know that, because I'm not the one in charge of the military conflict over there. I don't even do well with the person cutting me off on the road, to go back to the more innocuous one. How do we handle that?
I love the idea of curiosity as a part of the mind of Christ, because it was what hinders you from having the mind of Christ? What would you change? What would change in your life and relationships? No, but go on, shoot. If your mind were more fully captivated by Christ, and I don't always confuse people with curiosity, obviously, but it's strange how much your interactions with people that you know just a little bit, and people that you know really well, or like your family members that you just can't listen to for one more moment, whenever you stop and take a second and you're actually curious, and you're asking, I guess it's just like good faith questions and stuff like that, but when you have a genuine curiosity, not even necessarily to be swayed by their point of view, but just to know them as human beings more, like, that action or viewpoint that is so hurtful, and saying what's underneath that, like, where's the desire of God, and having curiosity about those things. I just am, frequently unsuccessful, but much more successful, I feel like, I don't know, viewing people in a Christ-like way whenever I have just a lot of curiosity about them.
And I'd say there's also a level of commitment in relationships. Like, if you've been married, your spouse did things you don't like, and you put up with them. Now, you might have started to resent them, but in general, like there's a lot of things you put up with that you didn't resent them for. You said, that's just his way. That's just how she does it, right? But then when you saw someone not do who's not your spouse do that, I hate you for not putting your clothes away. I'm just being totally honest about this. There's things I tolerate about my wife because that's just her. But if someone else who's not my wife does it, I hate them for doing it
Because you love your wife and you don't.
because
want
I've committed to my wife.
Yeah.
And I haven't extended that commitment to the other person. So it makes me wonder if part of the mind of Christ isn't also extending my commitments to other people.
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes I think, just like it's easy to, it's easier to be curious about people that we love. And it's really hard to be curious about people who we don't.
Mhm.
And sometimes for me, I think, curiosity has to take the place of love until I can find something lovable.
I think
That's a
that's,
strategy of mine.
that's
not
an
a
amazing,
strategy.
that's an
Whatever.
amazing, I'm very impressed with your self-awareness. That's so amazing.
Oh, that's-
Cause I think that curiosity you're talking about reduces suffering for you.
Yeah.
And, I went through a period of time when I taught high school kids and, it was just like being in a loony bin. It was crazy. And there were times when I was afraid for myself.
Yeah.
And what I would do is I'd come to school in the morning and I'd look at all of those 30 people out there. And I just envisioned 30 incubators in the hospital. There's these babies. And that would take away my fear because I'm like, these are babies. And then I'd be curious, like you say, about what kind of home did they come from? Why are they acting like that? And usually you could figure out, if they were, maybe the parents were never there and that's why they acted like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, because their behaviors, it impacts you, but it's
Mhm.
about them.
That's right, that's right. So I couldn't take anything personally,
Oh, that's
but I know what you're talking about. That curiosity is wonderful, isn't it? It's sort of a way to take down the stress and have you get a new perspective. Because we're not taught to do that. We're
Yeah.
kind of brainwashed to just hate somebody if they do something we don't like,
So one last thought, I know we're already over time. There's this whole section about building, right? Building on a foundation with wood, hay, and straw, or gold and silver and precious stones, right? And look, I don't think Paul's saying when we die, God's got a set of scales. And God's gonna weigh everything you did and test it with fire. I think it's just a simple thought. Are we building stuff that's gonna last? And what lasts? It doesn't come in Corinthians, it comes in Galatians, where Paul says, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control. Those are the fruits of the spirit. So like, those are the things that outlive us. When we die, those things don't die. But there is some good news. When we die, like pettiness, envy, that dies with us. I mean, it's actually sort of nice to know that doesn't outlive us. That has a shelf life. So the question is, what are we building? Something that lasts or something that's not? Honestly, we're building both. We're building both. And maybe the mind of Christ says, hey, I've got materials, I've got plans. I could go either way here. I could go either way. But maybe I'm going to redraw the plans so that they last. Hey, thanks for sticking this out today. And next week we'll talk about imitating Christ.
This came through.